Of Men and Spiders, Chapter 1, by DrBlackJack. She was trapped in a world of fire and chaos. She had failed in her latest challenge, and the price of that failure would likely be her life. As she tumbled to the world below, she wrapped her hands around herself in a final desperate attempt to survive the impending crash into the jungle world below. The shaking grew worse as the ancient home was buckled and buffeted by unforgiving winds for the first time in countless years. Then there was an impact, and the world grew dark. She didn't know how long she lay in darkness, but as she finally clawed her way back to consciousness, she became aware of a few things. First, the ancient home was in ruins. It was more of a pile of rubble than a home fit for she. Countless generations had been spent making the place, and now it was no more than rock and ash. Second, while she was alive, she was severely injured. Digging her way out of this mess could still be the death of her. Third, many of her hands were now dead. Once, she had controlled countless hands. Now, only a few remained. Finally, she was hungry. If she was going to take advantage of the second chance she had been given, she must feed. With a silent command, she sent what eyes and hands she could spare out into this new primitive world to bring her food. She would need a significant amount of biological matter if she was going to rebuild her colony. Alice was enjoying her vacation, mostly. The air was fresh, the water clean, and the land was beautiful. She's never seen anything like it. The only problem was her family didn't seem happy to be here as she was. Her mom was usually so fun and happy. She'd smile and giggle all day long, speaking to fairies only she could see. However, after landing on this planet, she got angry. She said it was because she couldn't get any medicine here. Apparently, she really needed her medicine too, because not long after that, she got sick. Really sick. At first, she was Let me try that again. At first, she was sweating a lot. Then she had a tummy ache that didn't seem to go away. Scott told her she needed to drink more water to replace what she was losing, and maybe go for a swim to clean herself off. But all she really wanted to do was sleep all day. Or shout at Scott. Scott was a bit better. When he went on walks with Alice, he seemed happy enough, or at least less angry than usual. He didn't have that same scowl he always had when Dad was around, and Dad wasn't here with them. He'd said he had to walk with some men and needed them to disappear for a while. Apparently, disappear meant go camping, and Alice was okay with that. Alice was swimming while Scott sat on a nearby rock and kept an eye on her. And by swimming, she meant she was wading around in the water, finding cool new plants and bugs to play with. Looking over at her brother, Alice could see Scott was actually smiling for once. That's the first time in a long time Alice could remember she'd seen him really smile, and it made her so happy she just had to go splash him. Scott tried to keep from getting annoyed at his new damp station. Then he got an evil idea and developed a smile that matched his thoughts. Apparently, the smile gave something away because Alice meeped and tried to dive underwater, but she wasn't nearly fast enough. Scott scooped her up before hurtling her out into the slightly deeper water. His sister surfaced and had the audacity to look annoyed with him. Scott merely splashed some more water at his sister. "You started it, Munchkin. Don't start something if you're not prepared to see it through." Apparently, Alice's anger was just for show because she quickly switched back to a toothy grin as she held up her fist, which was now wrapped in the leather cord that had held his medallion, his most prized possession. It was the only thing he had left from his father. His real father. Not the loser his drug-muddled mom called a husband these days. Scott sputtered in indignation that was at least half real. "How'd you get that? Give that back." Alice smiled even wider. If you want it, come and get it. She then dove further into the water, forcing Scott to swim after her. Several minutes later, after plenty of roughhousing, swimming, and a final shot of victory, Scott was back on land, drying himself out on the rocks as he examined his medallion, remembering better times. Alice crept up behind him and looked over his shoulder at his prize. Tell me about your dad again. Scott looked at his little sister with a half-exasperated grin. Why do you want to listen to me talk about him? You've already heard all my stories. Alice collapsed her legs into a seat the way only the very young can, and grinned. Yeah, but it always makes you happy to talk about him. Scott felt his smile fall a little. No, it doesn't. It makes me sad. Alice tilted her head. It makes you both, but more happy than sad. You're proud of him. Scott felt his eyes tear up a little, but also felt his smile return. Well, yeah, who wouldn't be? He was a hero. Did I ever tell you about the time he fought off a dozen pirates who'd snuck aboard his ship? Alice beamed her toothy grin. Yep, but tell it again anyway. Scott smiled. Okay. It all started when some pirate heard him talking about his next delivery while he was at port. The pirate decided to rob him in space so that Dad couldn't call for help. So he snuck on board the ship with a dozen other pirates. As Scott told his story, Alice listened eagerly. She was most looking forward to the big fight at the end. Scott always got so animated when he reached that part. This was one of his favorite stories. She was watching her hands work through the vision granted by her eyes. Her hands roamed far and wide in search of nutrients necessary to ensure she could flourish on this planet. One hand came across a particularly bountiful specimen. It had died only recently and was still in excellent condition. It was wrapped in strange material that she did not recognize. In fact, the whole area was littered with strange and unrecognizable materials. She instructed a few other hands to go to the site and retrieve samples of the odd materials. She didn't know if there was anything to be gained from them, but she did not become she by ignoring learning opportunities. Most of her hands had retrieved full loads and were on their way back, but one was still gathering materials when a couple of beasts stumbled into the clearing. They were clearly the same species as the dead specimen she'd found, but they appeared different in size, color, and other characteristics. Perhaps they were its offspring, or maybe the genders of the species were severely dimorphic, or even trimorphic. She supposed it didn't matter. There would probably be countless other specimens on the planet to study. For now, she needed sustenance. She ordered her hand to acquire the specimens for consumption. Scott approached the campsite in disbelief. The whole thing was in ruins, as if it had been ransacked while they were gone. At first, he'd been furious. The only thing he could think of was that their mom had finally snapped due to the withdrawals and had given into a full psychosis-fueled fit. But his anger turned to icy fear when a spider the size of a large dog crawled out of the underbrush, reaching towards him with what appeared to be some rather wicked-looking pincers. Scott stood transfixed, his mind whirling so fast he couldn't act on any thought before another 10 started to take its place. He might have stood there frozen until he died, if not for an urgent tugging on his pant legs. With horror, Scott remembered Alice was there with him, but this time, instead of locking him in place, his fear pushed him into action. Turning around, he lifted her under his arm and took off running. As he weaved through the trees, he could hear the skittering of the monsters in close pursuit. Maybe if he'd been on his own, he could have outrun this thing, but carrying Alice, there was no way he'd get away. Looking around furiously, he noticed a tree with low branches. Scott didn't know if the monsters could climb, but without time to plan, it was all he could think of. Running to the tree, he hopped up, grabbing the branch, and hauled himself and Alice up. From there, he grabbed the next branch and repeated the process. Over and over he climbed, putting as much distance between himself and the ground as he could. He only looked down once he'd made enough headway that he was confident the thing couldn't easily jump up to get them. The monster circled the tree a few times, as though trying to puzzle out what to do next. Then, to Scott's horror, it began to climb. It wasn't as quick or as efficient as Scott, but that didn't really matter. It essentially had them cornered. Alice tugged on his sleeve. She was crying. "What about Mommy? What happened to Mommy?" Scott closed his eyes and fought back unwanted tears. She might have been a drugged-up loser these days, but she was his mom too. Once upon a time, she'd been a good mother. From what he'd seen of the camp, there was no way she'd survived the attack. When he opened his eyes again, Scott could see the monster had made it past the first branch and was steadily getting closer. He didn't have time to mourn. If he didn't do something now, he and Alice were both going to die. Patting his pocket, he pulled out a folding knife he had from the time he'd briefly studied to be an explorer, scouting new planets. That time was long gone, and this knife was nowhere near enough to get the job done. Looking around for something else, he also saw a dead branch near at hand. It looked ready to fall, but it wouldn't take much effort to break it loose. Looking back at his knife, he finally had a plan. Reaching up, Scott tore the branch free and quickly stripped the twigs from the stem. That done, he took out his medallion and used the leather cord to tie the knife to the stick. It wasn't very sturdy, and he'd probably only get one good attack in, but it was all he had, and he just had to make his attack count. The whole time he worked, Alice had been watching, her mind finally going numb with everything going on around her. Scott looked at her and made eye contact. "Hey, Munchkin, if this works, you and I might be on our own for a little while, and I'm going to need your help, so stay with me. If it doesn't work, well, it'll work. It has to." Alice nodded numbly, and Scott looked back down at the monster climbing up the tree. He closed his eyes one last time and took a deep breath. He didn't have time to wait long. So, despite his fear, he forced his eyes open and pushed himself off the branch. With a scream born of primal rage and fear, he fell onto the spider, jamming his improvised spear into one of its eyes. As the boy and spider fell, he shoved the spear deeper, feeling impacts on the branch as he and the spider tumbled and fell. Finally, they hit the ground, and Scott rolled away. Standing back up, he still had the stick in his hand, but the knife had broken loose and fallen to the ground next to the spider. Scott's heart sank when the spider pulled itself up to its legs as well. When the spider took a step towards him, he gripped the stick tightly, preparing to use it as a club in a final desperate attempt to survive. Then, unexpectedly, the spider froze. Scott wasn't sure what was happening, but they sat there, staring at each other in total silence for over a minute. After enough time passed that Scott started wondering if the spider was somehow dead on its feet, the thing turned and started walking away. Yep, that's pretty much what I was going with. Also, it is interesting that you decided to throw this one at me. This is very similar to a lot of other things that my stories do. I'll talk with you after the stream about this, but this could actually fit into the Dark Forest extremely well. She was astonished. These were not just another couple of stupid animals. The way the larger one had combined metal and stick, it was clear. These were tool users. For a dreadful moment, she wondered if they were intelligent, and she'd been hunting thinking sentient beings. She ordered her hand to freeze and tried speaking with the beast. When that failed, she tried shouting with all her strength. Still no response. It didn't even act as if it could hear her. She sighed in relief. She was no monster, after all. She did not want to eat something intelligent. Still, these were obviously clever beasts, capable of more advanced problem-solving than most simple creatures. She could learn a lot from observing them. Right now, stranded on a strange planet, all alone and diminished as she was, that knowledge could easily be worth more than mere temporary sustenance. She ordered her hand to leave them be, and instead directed several of her eyes to follow and observe these strange, thinking beasts, hoping they might teach her something that would tip the scales scales of survival in her favor. Scott didn't want to return to camp. There very well might be more of these things nearby after all, but without some supplies, there was no way the two of them could survive on their own for any length of time. Sorting through the debris, it was clear that the campsite had been ransacked for some reason. Scott couldn't decide if it was a blessing or a curse that their mother's body was nowhere to be found. What was worse was that whatever had done this had done a disturbingly thorough job of cleaning the place out. Almost everything metal had been taken. That included anything from electronics to their pots and pans. The tents were torn to shreds, but Scott grabbed a sizable strips he could find and used them as a makeshift backpack to store any other odds and ends that could be salvaged. There was a profound relief when he found the first aid supplies and a decent amount of dried and packaged food. It would last them a little over a week. Not a long time, but maybe long enough for them to adapt to their new living situation. Assuming they survived long enough, that is. After gathering everything they could find, Scott took the time to treat some of his abrasions. They weren't severe, but out here the last thing they needed was for him to be laid low by an infection, just because he didn't take a small cut serious enough. As he worked, Alice hovered nearby, hugging her favorite stuffed rabbit tightly while staring with eyes that were clearly lost. She was in shock, and for now, that was fine. If they lived long enough, Scott could see to her mental and emotional well-being. But first, they had to survive. Everything complete, he shouldered his improvised pack. It wasn't perfect, but they needed to move. He was not going to stay here after what had just happened. Wherever they set up camp, he would make sure it was as far away from this location as he could safely get. She watched the two specimens as they worked. The larger one had a purpose to its actions, though they made little sense to she. It seemed excited by the discovery of the container that had smelled of various toxins. Perhaps he would incorporate those chemicals into some kind of self-defense mechanism? It applied a couple of the substances to a break in his hide before wrapping it up. Perhaps it took time to absorb it safely. It once again became excited at the discovery of the odd scentless packs she hadn't gathered yet. Those were originally going to be collected by the hand she'd attacked them with, but she decided to let the specimens have them and watch and see what they'd do with them. The other, smaller specimens simply stood around, not doing anything productive. Perhaps it was still juvenile, unable to attend to its own needs. Eventually, the larger of the two took the smaller one by its grasping appendage, and they started to walk away. As they walked, she came up with several hypotheses based on their actions. The larger specimen was probably female. She seemed to be the dominant one and appeared to be in charge of all decision-making, while the smaller one, possibly a male, seemed more limited either due to the lack of development or perhaps greater specialization. Also, the female seemed to be the female seemed to have a heightened awareness of their situation, acting as both a primitive she and a guard, while the male seemed oblivious to its surroundings, obviously entirely dependent on its she to survive. The obvious choice would be to cut the male off and begin anew elsewhere, But perhaps the female needed the male to mature to begin its new colony. She noticed a den of what were likely predators in the direction they were traveling. Wanting to ensure the survival of her new specimens, she directed her hands to clear the current residents out of the area. They'd been large and of ill temperament, but her hands had been more than up to the task. Additionally, the previous residents of the area would provide further sustenance for her, as she took time to study her new specimens. Perhaps her failure above would lead to even greater success down on this planet. Her colony might thrive once again in the coming days.